Great. Okay, so tonight we are considering this question of how do we get board members on board with pay equity and arts worker care? And like I said earlier, yes, we are focusing on boards because they are a very important part, critical part of nonprofit work, but also this can apply to lots of different folks. And then thinking about how can board leaders leverage their seats at the table to affect equitable change. Those are kind of our two big questions. So we want to start by defining some terms. The first term is, what is pay equity? So pay equity at the very base is compensating workers without discrimination. And I want to shout out to Elsa and on our team for all the work that they've done around this. We'll drop that resource in as well. But this like kind of literal definition is balance, right? That it's equal, it's the same. If you're doing this type of work, everybody's getting paid the same amount. When we talk about pay equity, though, what also often comes up is paying people righteously or well or fairly. And our first town hall was about this idea of what does it mean to thrive. And we have notes from the field there that you can check out. But in order to think about, so pay equity has become kind of code for more than just this base definition, right? It's become code for all of these other things. And so at Second Story, we've started to use the phrase arts worker care to kind of capture this umbrella idea. So pay equity is a component of caring for arts workers, but so is things like paying a thriving wage, right? So paying well, not just paying everybody the same, right? Because paying everybody terribly is equal, but it isn't necessarily taking care of them, right? So this arts worker care idea, when we're using that phrase, we're thinking about paying thriving wages, having robust benefit packages, thinking about how to care for independent contractors and freelance folks, so folks who are outside of that staff structure, thinking about arts workers with disabilities or folks who are parents, and how we can build an ecosystem that cares for their needs, thinking about how work is structured, right? Like, are jobs right-sized for people, and do people have time off, and these kinds of things. So being transparent about pay practices. So back to that idea that the core of this is that arts work is labor, and that labor should be compensated as well as anything else that we think is valuable in terms of labor. So those are just the two terms that we wanted to put into the space before we jump into this conversation. And we want to seed this a little bit by asking you all participants to, in the chat, would you drop a quick answer to this question? So I'd love for you to think of a moment or a type of moment where you have encountered resistance yourself, like in yourself. And what do you need to get on board with something new to you or challenging to you? So I'll use Lauren, our managing director, as an example. She knows I'm doing this. I okayed it with her. But she's a breadcrumb person, right? So if you have a big thing that you want to bring forward, it's better to drop a little crumb, be like, hey, why don't you think about this for a minute, right? And then come back a little bit later and, drop another breadcrumb, because she will articulate for herself that she needs time to sit with things, right? And if she's having a big feeling about something like, oh, that feels really risky or scary, time to sit with that, right? So that kind of time is something that she has articulated. So as you think about your own kind of resistance to big things or new things, what helps you? Is it time, data, flattery, success stories, expert opinions and testimony? What do you need to get on board? I invite you to drop that idea in the chat. Understanding and compassion. All right, so somebody kind of makes space for that. Data and an execution plan. I love, okay, those are two, there's lots of triangulation happening here, right? Some person is I need feelings, and somebody else is give me some data, right? Validation, empathy, trust, a clear vision, right? So do I have a sense of what I'm getting on board with, right? Timeline. I need to understand the details of what is expected. Great. That's very specific, right? What are these things that you're asking me to do? Time and opportunity for reframing big picture. So like that kind of, can I get micro and then can I come back out and look at the big picture? Can I get micro, like that kind of thing? Time to mull, and mulling over some as evidence helps. It doesn't necessarily have to be data. Yeah, that's a great point, right? Like we think a lot about data as it has to be numbers and quantitative and all this kind of stuff, but sometimes it's very qualitative, right? Or it's a testimonial, that kind of stuff. Thank you. These are wonderful ideas. So we'll keep this, that chat will be there for us, and we will keep referring back to these ideas as we think about how to get people on board with stuff. So now let's hear from our guests. Jess and Dana, we're going to invite both of you to speak. Jess has been on the board for, she's our longest serving board member, has been on the board for going on 12 years. And so has seen the organization from when we had an annual budget of like $75,000 a year and was a largely volunteer powered organization to today, where we have a budget around $500,000 and 5 full-time staff members. So Jess, I just want to invite you to speak for a couple minutes about what has that been like? Like, what has that arc been like from your experience as a board member? What are the things that you would note to the group about that arc of change?
Yeah, thank you. So like Amanda said, I've been around a long time, and I was really drawn to the organization because of the mission and the work that the people around the table here, so to speak, do every day. And I started because of that and because of that community. And why I thought it was a good fit when I joined was because of my fundraising experience. So being a volunteer-powered organization, and it being a working board in the truest sense of the word, I could bring my fundraising experience to the quote unquote staff and help with fundraising campaigns. So help write things, help proofread, help come up with ideas, help come up with campaigns, et cetera. And the artistic body was really involved in the running of the organization, and the leadership was equally very committed, even though sometimes we had to ask them to defer their paychecks, unfortunately, so that we could cover rent. And so, that really speaks to the commitment that was around the table, right? But we knew that wasn't very sustainable. And part of how I think we got there from there to where we are today is because of that long-term view and strategy. It was really a long time coming in that way. And Amanda had and still has that long-term view. And she knew what she didn't know and still does. And seeks expertise from outside the organization, including things like the Arts Work Fund and other consultants to help create internal alignment and really understand the external resources that we needed in order to have that strong presence in the community that could connect the art and the fundraising world and really make that have a strong foundation so that we could kind of keep going from a place of strength. None of it happened overnight, and the idea of this arts worker care, as you hear me stumbling over the words, is still something that's a new vocabulary, even though we were kind of doing it years ago. We weren't calling it that because that didn't exist in the same way. But we always knew that we wanted to take care of our people. We had and have, as a board, a deep trust in Amanda and her vision. She helped hire Lauren, and that has been a pretty dynamic duo, as have the staff that have grown, many around the table here, and the company has continued to grow and be strong. So I think some of the pieces that helped us get to where we are too are really the complementary skills that everyone brought to it, right? Everyone's a puzzle piece. No one is exactly the same. And so we can really make sure we don't have any yes people, right? So to that question that was there earlier, trying to think about what are our commonalities and what are the places where we can push back, and how can we make sure that we are doing our best by our staff, by our leaders, and having the artistic representation too, to make sure that we aren't thinking only as a board of the people who are in front of us, which are primarily staff, right? Or the closest that comes to it is staff. So we have had a lot of luck, but a lot of the luck has been as a result of strategy, right? We think it's luck, but it's after lots of hard work and lots of thought and lots of effort, and capitalizing on those lucky breaks that we do get, right? Capitalizing on the alchemy that's in front of us. So all of which is to say, even though I think we have a special story, it can be replicated, right? All parts of it can be thought of through a different perspective at a different organization who might be at a different place in their growth. And one of the things I'll kind of close with here is that my personal feeling, having been on the board for as long as I have, is really working hard to not live in that fear, right? Of not trying to say, oh my gosh, 2 years ago, we couldn't pay rent. How are we going to even think about giving people more money or paying more people or anything like that, right? So really trying to understand my own vision and what I'm bringing to the table that is about today, right? Looking at the present state of the organization and reacting based on that, as opposed to fear of the history, and having really that faith in our leaders, be they board leaders, be they staff, be they company leaders, et cetera. So that's a little bit of my perspective so far on the board, and I'll let Dana take it from there.
Thank you. I just want to lift up one thing that Jess said, which is like, this has, like, when we sat down to kind of track the journey, it's probably a 10 or a 12-year path for us, right? Thinking about, we had a huge board turnover right at the top of my tenure, which was almost, well, 16 years ago at this point. And we did a bunch of rebuilding of the board. Then we had a grant through the Arts Work Fund that was around capitalization and fundraising. And then we had a big mission, vision, values revamp, right? And so we weren't aiming the ship in this direction. Or we weren't using the vocabulary that we were aiming the ship in this direction, but we have been laying the groundwork for it for a decade. So it just feels like that's something that is worth like lifting up in terms of one of the things that Jess said. Also, that idea, I love what you said about like, I need to not remember this stuff, but also it is very present, right? Like that fear of, gosh, what happens if we do misstep? What are the repercussions for that? So Dana's been a board member for about 5 years. And joined the organization actually not long before the pandemic hit, and currently serves as our board treasurer, and is deeply familiar with our finances, therefore. So Dana, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the arc that you've seen in about half the tenure that Jess is talking about.
Sure. Yeah. So Amanda, like you just said, I joined the latter end of that arc. So I've been a board member for a little over 5 years. I was drawn to and introduced to the organization through prior work that I did as a consultant. So myself and a former coworker conducted a workshop series with some follow-on coaching, specifically for arts leaders to build capacity and expertise around strategic financial management. Met Lauren and Amanda through that work, fell in love immediately, and saw this organization as I could see the potential not just to use the art of storytelling as a tool for equity and social justice, but I also very quickly saw the potential, specifically through the leadership of Lauren and Amanda, for this organization to be a real example and potential thought partner as it relates to best practices in the arts management world, and particularly as it relates to pay equity. So again, joined a little over 5 years ago. So I got a good year and change in before the pandemic, and then things went, how they went. We were much smaller when I started. I think we were well under $300,000, and now we're much bigger than that. So I think throughout my tenure, the themes have been management of pretty significant growth, number one, constant change tied to not just that growth, but the external circumstances tied to the pandemic, the social and political reckoning that happened, we're still sort of in right now. And so it's a pretty anxiety-inducing time as a human being, never mind as a board member. And I think it's sort of grappling with this question of, there's so many risks from a financial perspective. Is now the right time to be really leaning into pay equity? But in actuality, there's no better time given what's happening in the world, and given, like we've talked about, how perpetually undervalued the work of arts workers has been, and sort of, let's be part of leading this charge. So I will say, I don't think, especially as a Black queer woman, there was no buy-in to the value of this concept of arts worker care. It was always sort of a question of, how are we really going to do this, and how are we going to pay for it? And I think a lot of the foundational work that Jessica and Amanda talked about was hugely important in helping us get to this journey, which we are still on. So I think, again, we are I'm lucky to be and proud to be a part of an organization that is, we're pretty financially sound. We've been pretty successful in covering our costs. We've been able to maintain at least some type of reserves in the years that I've been a part of that. And I fully understand and respect that puts us in solid footing and in a position that other organizations may or may not be in. But it, of course, affords you a level of risk tolerance that you wouldn't have had that position not been there. But I also think beyond just the financial position, there's been a lot of attention around, and I fully credit Lauren for this, of really establishing a very solid common baseline around the numbers and democratizing that experience around the numbers, because we're not all numbers people. I love it, but some people's eyes glaze over when they look at a report out of QuickBooks and don't see like fancy graphs or pictures or what have you. And so I think there's been a lot of work around democratizing that experience and prioritizing the presentation of financials in the context of all of our board meetings, because there's so many levers that come to play when you're thinking about anything as weighty as compensation or pay equity. Your revenue targets influence it, your expense targets influence it, your capital position influences it. So the more that you can get a broader set of board members comfortable with the numbers, I think that speaks to the data and the comfort that we were hearing in some of the chat before. I also think that understanding what is your baseline for comparison and how are you using that to determine gaps, whether it's living wages, like arts sector surveys, other organizations who you are in communion with or developing some type of community of practice and trust with. So really understanding what you're using as a point of comparison and figuring out what your gap is. And then I think, again, speaking to the timeline comments that we saw in the chat and also just the time needing to digest it, really being intentional about doing this work or thinking about doing this work in a phased approach. You can't necessarily get there or fully to where you may want to be within the span of 6, 12 months, or even 2 years for certain organizations, and depending on where you land in terms of your equity goals. But I think it's breaking it down into what we can do this year versus year 2 versus year 3, I think is really critical. And looking in that at the context of all of your financial realities and financial risks. But I think, again, there was a lot of the work, particularly the visioning work and the capacity building work that was done, I think in the first half of that 10 to 12 year period was absolutely critical in the second part. And I don't see even the progress that we've made, even though we're still on the journey. I don't think that would have been possible without a lot of that really intentional capacity building and infrastructure work that went in the first half of that 10 to 12 year journey, for sure.